What do a marathon runner lost in the Sahara, a cook trapped in an overturned ship at the bottom of the ocean, and a mountaineer who crawled out of a glacier crevice with a broken leg have in common? At first glance, nothing. Different continents, different elements, different circumstances. But all of them are united by one simple truth. When it feels impossible to take another step, a force is found that makes you take one more. These are stories of people who reach the edge, where pain, fear, and despair seem endless. But it's precisely there, in the sands of the desert, in the cold darkness of the depths, and in icy solitude, that they found their true selves and endured. To survive in conditions that break even the strongest. 9 days under the scorching sun, without food, almost without water, lost in the most inhospitable corner of the planet. The Sahara. This is not fiction. This is the real story of Mauro Prosperi, an Italian for whom the desert became a battleground with himself. Mauro Prosperi was never just an athlete. His life is an example of discipline, endurance, and devotion. A former police officer, pentathlete, participant in the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles, he knew well what physical and psychological strain meant. But in 1994, ordinary challenges were no longer enough. He wanted more, a real test of his limits. That's when he decided to take part in the Marathon des Sables, one of the toughest ultramarathons in the world. It's not just a marathon. It's a hellish trial over 250 kilometers long, taking place in the Moroccan part of the Sahara. Participants must carry everything themselves: food, sleeping bag, first aid kit. The only thing the organizers provide is a minimal amount of water. No external help, no comfort, just you, the merciless desert, and your resolve. Prosperi wasn't looking for fame. For him, it was a personal challenge. He trained for months, prepared his gear, and thought through every detail. In the early days of the race, everything went according to plan. He maintained his pace and was among the top 10. But everything changed in an instant. On the 4th day of the race, a powerful sandstorm rose over the desert. It covered the participants like a giant blanket of scorching dust. The storm lasted about 8 hours, destroying all landmarks. Sand buried everything: his face, backpack, water. The air became unbreathable. Most runners stopped in shelters, waiting for help or direction from organizers. But Prosperi decided to keep moving. He trusted his navigation skills with a compass. When the storm subsided, he found himself alone. No trail, no other runners, no support crew. Around him, endless sand dunes, sun, sky, and silence. Not a single clue of where he was. He believed he could return to the route, but time passed and the landscape remained unchanged. The next morning, Prosperi realized the worst. He was running out of water. In the Sahara, the body loses moisture dozens of times faster than in regular environments. He recalled all the survival skills he had learned: how to move on sand, how to conserve energy, how to avoid heat stroke. He wrapped his head in cloth to protect himself from the sun, traveled mostly at night or at dawn, and hid in the shade of dunes during the day. Without food, his body quickly weakened. He inspected every bush, searching for life: insects, lizards, even roots with drops of moisture. On the 5th day, he stumbled upon a half-ruined Muslim shrine, a small building that offered at least minimal shelter. There, he caught a few bats that he was able to eat. Brutal? To an outside eye, maybe. But in the fight for life, aesthetics don't exist. Occasionally, planes flew overhead. He waved cloth, arranged signal markers with stones. But no pilot saw him. Loneliness, exhaustion, and physical decline were eating away at his will. One day, he even wrote a farewell note to his family, thinking his story was ending. He tried to end his life by cutting his wrists with a knife. But due to dehydration, no blood flowed. It was the darkest moment of his life. But just then, when it seemed no strength remained, something inside him awoke. A deep instinct for self-preservation pushed him to continue. On the 9th day, he noticed goat tracks, a sign that water and people might be nearby. He followed them, though his legs barely held. Eventually, he saw a young shepherd girl. She was frightened by the sight of a burned, emaciated man who looked more like a ghost than a human. But soon she returned with adults, who gave him water, food, and first aid. It turned out he had wandered into Algeria, more than 290 kilometers from the place where he disappeared. An incredible distance. He covered it with almost no resources, guided only by instinct and unbreakable will. At the hospital, doctors couldn't believe their eyes. He had lost over 15 kilograms but was still conscious. His internal organs were functioning, barely. He spent several weeks in rehabilitation, with full recovery taking months. Then came a long psychological recovery. But Mauro didn't break. His story became a global sensation. It appeared in newspapers, on television, in books. Some didn't believe it. It seemed too incredible. But numerous testimonies, documents, and witnesses confirmed. It all really happened. And what's most astonishing, a few years later, Mauro returned to the Marathon des Sables. He finished it, closing that painful chapter of his life. Later, he participated in the race several more times. Mauro Prosperi said, "The desert is a place where you leave behind everything unnecessary. There, you understand who you really are." His story isn't just about a marathon in the Sahara, but about battling fear, exhaustion, and solitude. When the path seemed lost, he kept going. One more step, one more day. Prosperi didn't conquer the desert. He accepted its challenge. And that made him stronger. His experience is a reminder, in the darkest moments, an incredible strength awakens in us. But it's not only the desert that tests the human spirit. Sometimes the elements strike deep beneath the water. Years passed. A storm raged on the surface. Rescue operations couldn't begin due to the weather. Everyone thought the crew was dead. And indeed, everyone except Harrison had perished. He was the only one left. In complete darkness, without food, immersed in water, on a sunken ship. His skin began to soften and peel. His tongue suffered from the salty water. He could hear sounds coming from nearby compartments. Thuds, like something alive was trying to break through. He was sure it was sharks, drawn by the scent of corpses. The realization of his own vulnerability in such conditions was even more terrifying than the darkness itself. Harrison did not lose hope. He prayed. He listened. He waited. Hours passed and then, days. His flashlight died, his Coca-Cola ran out, his skin burned, but he survived. Despite the darkness, cold, and panic, Harrison managed to pull together what little strength he had left to search for anything that could help him survive. He had no idea how much time he had, but he knew one thing. If he didn't get his body out of the water, he'd freeze to death. Diving blindly into a nearby cabin, he ran into some wooden panels. He tore one off the wall and swam back to his little pocket of air. That was the first piece of what would become his platform. But it wasn't enough. He had to keep diving, again and again. After several dives, he gathered a few more planks, some broken furniture, a mattress, and even a can of Coke. With all of that, he managed to build something like a raft or stand, just enough to lift himself a few centimeters above the water. It was a game changer. Now his heart, lungs, and part of his torso were in the air, which helped slow down the heat loss and gave him a better shot at staying alive. That wooden plank, just an ordinary piece of debris, ended up being one of the key things that saved his life. And after an unbelievably long 60 hours following the disaster, he saw light. Flickering, unsteady, but real. He thought it was a hallucination. But when the light began to move, he realized it was a person, a diver. Someone was swimming underneath him. Harrison carefully touched the diver's hand so as not to startle him. The diver froze, then quickly swam upward. He couldn't believe anyone was alive. Everyone thought this was a body recovery mission, but everything had changed. Now it was a real rescue. When the divers returned, Harrison was brought to the surface. But he couldn't simply be lifted up. After spending so long underwater at that depth, he was at risk of decompression sickness, a condition where nitrogen bubbles in the blood can cause deadly consequences. So before bringing him up, he was placed in a special decompression chamber, where he stayed for another 2.5 days. After that, he was physically and mentally exhausted, but alive. His story became a global phenomenon. Finally, on May 28th, Harrison O'Keefe stepped back onto land. He had survived. The story of his rescue spread across the world. He had been presumed dead, yet he had endured 60 hours underwater, without equipment, without light, alone. For a long time afterward, Harrison suffered from nightmares. He dreamed that his bed was sinking underwater. He swore he would never return to the sea again. But years later, he took another unbelievable step. He became a diver, and now works for the very same company that rescued him. This is not just a survival story. It's a story of spiritual strength, hope, and the ability to remain unbroken even in the deepest darkness. It's a story that proves, even in the darkest moment of life, a ray of light can be found, sometimes quite literally. In 1985, two young British climbers, Joe Simpson and Simon Yates, set off for Peru to attempt an ascent that no one had ever completed before. Their goal was the west face of Ciudad Grande, a majestic mountain in the Andes that was considered nearly unclimbable. Both already had experience conquering the Alps. They were well prepared, ambitious, and determined. But neither of them could have foreseen that this expedition would become not just a challenge, but a fight for survival. Ciudad Grande stands over 6,344 meters high, located in the Peruvian Andes. Its west face had never been climbed before. It consisted of steep ice, snow, and rocky ledges, with weather that could shift within minutes. This was a true test. Joe Simpson was 25 years old at the time. Simon Yates, only 21. Both were experienced but still very young climbers with a burning desire to leave their mark in history. They chose an alpine-style ascent. No base camps, no support teams, no extra gear. This meant that all necessities, food, water, tent, sleeping bags, had to be carried with them as they moved as quickly as possible. A risky but highly mobile approach with little room for error. The first days of climbing went well. They ascended steep ice walls, slept in snow shelters they dug themselves, melted snow for water, battled cold and wind. The weather was relatively stable, though the exhaustion was growing. Due to the altitude and physical strain, their bodies lost significant fluids. Water was vital, but melting snow consumed lots of gas, a limited resource. They had to drink less to conserve it. On June 8th, on the third day of climbing, they reached the summit. It was a triumph. The previously unconquered west face of Ciudad Grande had been climbed. They stood at the peak looking out over the endless snow-covered Andes, feeling their dream come true. But climbers know the real danger comes on the way down. Already the next day, everything changed. A blizzard began. Visibility dropped to zero. In these conditions, navigation was almost impossible. Descending steep, icy slopes, Joe slipped, misplanted his ice axe, and fell. The consequences were catastrophic. He broke his leg. Not just a clean break, the tibia rammed into the knee joint, tearing it apart. He knew he couldn't descend on his own. The pain was excruciating. But the thought of becoming a burden to his friend was worse. Simon faced an impossible choice. To leave his friend meant signing his death warrant. But trying to get him down meant risking his own life. Despite everything, he chose to save Joe. Simon built a makeshift pulley system using ropes, a 90-meter segment that allowed him to lower Joe down slope by slope. It was a Herculean effort. Simon had to bear Joe's weight, burying himself in snow to stay anchored. When the rope reached its end, Joe had to secure himself, and Simon would descend to repeat the process. Hours passed. Both were exhausted. Joe was nearly unconscious from the pain. Simon, at the edge of physical and mental collapse. But they kept going. For several hours, they descended like this, until a new disaster struck. Joe ended up hanging in the air, suspended over a deep crevasse. He had no way to secure himself or climb up. He couldn't see Simon or shout. The wind drowned everything. Simon, not knowing what had happened, only felt the rope pulling him down. He couldn't hold it much longer. He was in danger of being pulled off the slope himself. For an hour and a half, he held the rope, frozen, in agony, in complete uncertainty. Finally, Simon made a decision that would become one of the most controversial moments in the history of mountaineering. He cut the rope. It was an act of survival, and also of deep despair. Joe fell into the crevasse. Miraculously, he survived. His fall was broken by a snow ledge, after which he dropped even deeper, to the bottom of an icy cave. Injured, but alive. Alone in the dark, he knew he could either stay there and die or try to escape. But climbing up was impossible. The crevasse was too tall and smooth. So he made another choice: to go down into the unknown. Sliding, crawling, falling. He made his way through the crevasse until he saw a faint light. After hours of effort, Joe escaped the ice trap. But the worst was still ahead. A journey of several kilometers to the base camp, across glacier, rocks, and ravines. All with a shattered leg, no food, no water, and barely conscious. For 3 days, Joe crawled, hopped on one leg, collapsed, blacked out, fought through pain. His body was broken, but his will to live remained unshakable. He set micro goals: crawl to that rock, then another. He urinated on himself, drank meltwater from puddles, couldn't feel his legs. But he crawled. Crawled because he didn't want to die. He hallucinated, heard voices, thought he was already dead, yet kept crawling. Sometimes it felt like his body moved on its own, as if life itself refused to let go. But a fire still burned inside him. When he finally reached the camp, Simon was in shock. He had assumed his friend was dead. He had spent days tormented by guilt. And now, there he was. Alive, weak, but alive. They embraced. Both cried. It was a victory of the spirit over circumstance. Joe underwent multiple surgeries. Doctors told him he would never walk again, but they were wrong. 2 years later, he was climbing again. His story became the basis for the book Touching the Void and the film of the same name. One of the most powerful testaments to the strength of the human spirit. This isn't just a survival story. It's a story of choice, pain, loyalty, betrayal, and belief in yourself when nothing else remains. A story that proves, as long as you breathe, it's not over. Sometimes, to survive, you must do the impossible. And Joe Simpson proved it's possible.